everyone, and welcome to Friday, the 8th of June. I am Busin Amafaye, and this is your Business Morning, starting right now. One of the big stories, not just for Nigeria, but across the African continent, is what they call the China's debt diplomacy. A number of African countries are ramping up debts for infrastructure projects across the continent. In Nigeria, the Chinese are funding virtually almost every part of the country's infrastructure, from road, rail, and the energy sector. So what is this debt diplomacy all about, and what is the U.S. Doing about this expansion of China's footprint on the African continent? Let's start today's conversation on this very Pan-African note with a lot of lessons for Nigeria therein as we cross over on Skype to California. It's about 2 a.m. in the morning, and Grant Harris, who is the CEO of Harris Partners for Africa, is joining us live to discuss this. He's also a former advisor on Africa for former U.S. President Barack Obama. Grant, it's good to see you. Thanks for being up at this time to have this conversation with us.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Let's get started in terms of the China's debt profile and in terms of footprint on the African continent. What's your view?
My view is that it's something we need to take note of and figure out what it means. You mentioned the term debt diplomacy. Some call it debt trap diplomacy. It really depends on your perspective. But as we see growing levels of debt across sub-Saharan Africa, China has by far and away become the largest bilateral participant. And if you exclude South Africa, for instance, China holds about 14% of debt for sub-Saharan African countries. And this is quite influential in terms of the policies of those African countries and what it means, and what happens as well when there's risk of default.
Well, if you look at where we are right now, how important do you think China is to Africa, sitting in the United States and looking at how the Chinese are expanding on the continent? How important is it?
I think China is very important. China is making an aggressive commercial play across Africa, but it's not just economic. China is deepening its military ties. It's seeking greater soft power through media and through cultural exchanges. And through every facet of relationships, it's really trying to deepen its presence. And it's quite effectively forging these relationships across the continent. I think that in some ways, that's quite positive, particularly in the influx of capital to fund many infrastructure projects, and in its donations and contributions to peacekeeping missions and other endeavors. But there is another side to this as well, in terms of the debt trap that some of the cost-free or low interest or even loans of various natures that Chinese governments are providing in large quantities to African governments. Oftentimes, these are collateralized with strategic assets, assets such as ports and others that may not be as economically viable in the short run, but are very geopolitically significant in the long run and can sometimes really be at risk of forfeiture to the Chinese if you default on the debt. Or in other ways, you're beholden to Chinese companies and additional Chinese projects and trying to keep the relationship going.
Africa needs very critical infrastructure. I'm sure you will agree with me on this score, Grant. And we need, here on the continent, we need whoever has the deep pockets. United States has been a critical partner to Africa for decades and decades on. But the Chinese seems to have come to the table with cheap money and all of that. So do you think Africa should say no?
I don't think it's black and white. I think that Africa should be looking for partners that are diverse in nature and should not be beholden to any one country or economy. And I think that African leaders need to seek the best deal for their countries, which means insisting on transparency. It means insisting on environmental standards, local labor, technology transfer, and really seeking out the type of capital and infrastructure investments that will bring dividends beyond just a short-term economic return. So I don't think that Chinese capital should be refused, but I do think that there is a danger in being overly reliant on one country, and there is a danger to using strategic assets as collateral and to having a non-transparent process These Chinese loans are much different than what you would get from the World Bank or elsewhere, where the terms are published, where they're readily accessible. It's a pretty opaque process, and I think that there's a danger in that.
If you look at Nigeria, for example, we just put pen to paper as far as the Chinese yuan swap, currency swap is all about, and we want to start that in terms of trade. Do you think this type of relationship continues to leverage China over Nigeria and, of course, other African states where similar relationships on the currency side are being carried out?
I think that pursuing such a swap makes sense from a Nigerian government perspective. And I think that there are reasons to do that and to try to be nimble and to be thinking about different currencies. I think, though, the overall risk that I'm talking about is really making sure that it's the best deal. Part of the problem with some of the Chinese investments to date is that they've not been to standard, they've not been transparent, they've not been in the best interest of the citizens of different African states. That's not to say that everything that China is doing is negative or bad. It's not black and white, as I said. It's not zero sum. But I do think that it behooves all African leaders to realize there is no such thing as a free lunch. And there is a cost in various ways of these relationships. And the way that China is doing business with its no strings attached, but really there are strings attached type loans does have a real cost.
The current administration in Washington is in a trade war, quote unquote, but at least concerns with China. Here is Africa sitting in the middle, even geographically speaking, between the East and the West. How do you think Africa should decide who to go to bed with, technically speaking, in terms of trade and investment?
I think that savvy African states are going to be focused on their individual investment climates. They're going to be focused on regional integration to make their markets larger and more attractive. And they're going to need to realize that they're competing for capital, not just with their neighbors, but with other states around the world. And I think that they should be trying to attract that capital, not seeking one exclusive partner in the analogy that you used, and not really taking sides in disputes between China or the United States on trade issues that don't directly affect them. If I was an African leader, I'd be focused on courting this capital, making sure that the enabling environment is strong, and that goes to governance and rule of law and certainty of contract and many different issues that are going to be the deciding factors for whether businesses come in the type of numbers that we need to see. You mentioned a looming infrastructure gap. You mentioned a lot of impediments. We have to attract that private capital in order to plug that gap. And it all goes back to the investment climate in order to do so.